Needed highway in the state is from Swan to Toccoa. We need highway.
Folks ate my barbecue and didn't vote for me. But I thought you would enjoy seeing that. That is from a private collection that I have kept over the years. I have quite a number of them. And I think you can go over to the library if you're interested and get you a copy and take it home and listen to it. There are like 21 or 22 of these rallies in 1962. Now, are there any questions?
Didn't anybody use a speechwriter in those days? Frank Roosevelt had had him for 30 years.
Marvin Griffin was a journalist. He was the editor and publisher of his own newspaper. He did most of his stuff himself, although he did have a speechwriter who was well schooled in the Griffin philosophy. Any other questions? Okay, then we'll take a short break and then we'll visit with our good friend Ed Jenkins, who is going to inform us of a lot of good things that happened in Washington during the 16 years he was in the United States Congress. He made great plays. He was a champion debater. He was a campus hero to me because of the kind of man he is. But Ed has a brilliant career. He's been a federal prosecutor. He worked on the staff of Congressman Philip Landrum, who was our congressman in this area for a long time. In 1976, when Landrum retired, Ed ran for Congress and won, and served 8 consecutive terms before he decided to retire. Ed currently lives in Jasper. They have 1 child. They have children, grandchildren. He's very proud of that father. He's quite a man, and we're happy, Ed, to have you here today. So, first question I want to ask you, or favor I want to ask all of you, is tell us a little about being born and growing up in Young Harris.
Thank you, Bob. Of course, I didn't have much to do with it, but I couldn't have selected a better place. My grandfather and grandmother lived over in Robbinsville, North Carolina. And he had a country store in Robbinsville in Graham County. And in 1906, 100 years ago, this year, he decided to move his family out of North Carolina. And on horseback, he came looking for a place to settle. And he found Young Harris at a new college. And he purchased a store and boarding house, which was located where the present administration building is on campus. Come in, Richard. And he purchased this boarding house, which was primarily to house students back then. They didn't have a lot of dorms. And shortly thereafter, in 1910, my grandfather passed away, and my grandmother continued to, she had 7 children. She continued to live in Young Harris and lived here all of her life, the remaining years of her life, which were another 30 or 40 years. I was born on the edge of the campus here in Young Harris, and then my family moved to Larisville. My father was a barber at that time. He barbered for many years, was Zell Miller's uncle, who was, Zell's father was also here at that time, thereafter. And Bob and Zell and I finished in the same class in 1951. I'm going to really date this thing. But that's my roots. I just stopped over on my way over to the old Union Cemetery because my mother and father are both buried there, and my grandfather and my grandmother, who first came to 100 years ago this year. So that's how I came to a little bit of genealogy and history. Incidentally, I've been doing a little genealogy. You know, when you get older and you don't have much to do, you start looking back at your roots. And I've been over in North Carolina and visited Graham County and that area. Jonas Jenkins, who was my great-great-grandfather, came from Virginia, North Carolina. And his son, Jonas Jr., who is buried over in North Carolina, had a considerable role at the time of the removal of the Indians. I am part Cherokee. All of the Indians didn't leave. Some of them hid out in the mountains of North Carolina. But my family goes way back to the early days of Young Harris College.
Ed, when did you first get interested in politics?
I like to say at birth. I really became interested at Young Harris. As you know, the champion debate era of that time was a real force in getting people, youngsters, interested in public service. And Zell Miller had about, he'd gone to school here forever. He went to 2 years of high school here before at that time it was an academy, as well as a junior college. And there had been a former governor, who my father, who had stayed at the boarding house by the name of Ed Rivers. My dad was a big supporter of Ed Rivers, and it just sort of became natural that we would get into the political arena. I did not run for any office except the office that I ultimately served in. As you indicated, I did serve on staff in Washington. Incidentally, Eisenhower was then the president when I first went up there in 1959.
Yeah, I read in the Atlanta Journal about an old story I read just the other day on the internet, where quoting Zell Miller as saying that he wrote in your annual, "Will always be my best friend unless you run against me for the United States Senate."
That is correct. And he's tried me several times. We're still friends.
So there's no political.
Ed, there was a Jenkins born in Unica, North Carolina, that moved across to Tellico Plains, Tennessee, and he became a big lawyer. They called him the Terror of Tellico Plains. And they started running for governor one time in Tennessee. Are you familiar with that Jenkins?
I'm not familiar. I know who you're talking about, but I haven't traced that out. I will say that my grandfather owned property in Tellico Plains, so there must have been some connection.
Ed, let me tell you that we're very informal here, and you're liable to get a question from the audience. I asked that they raise their hands and be recognized, so they won't have three questioners in one.
They will find that I can be just as evasive as the question requires.
Well, if you went to Washington at a very historical time, we had Watergate, we had the resignation of President Nixon, we had the Jimmy Carter election, we had well, the country was generally sort of divided back then. So how was it to be a freshman congressman during that era?
It was a fascinating time, really. You are absolutely correct. At that time, the delegation was made up of the Georgia delegation, 10 members of the House. Today there are 13, I believe, 13 or 14. But at that time, there were 10. They were all Democrats. Both the United States senators were Democrat at that time. And I went there at the same time that Jimmy Carter was elected. That campaign was run in 1976. I got there in 1977. And we had an interesting race the first week I was there, because it was for the new speaker. And Tip O'Neill won the speakership. And Jim Wright from Texas became the majority leader by one vote in the House. the way this occurs, whichever party is the majority party, they caucus. The other party is not a part of this. And in this instance, it was the Democrats that had the majority. So we caucused and we voted over a series of candidates to narrow it down to the Speaker and the Majority Leader. And then you go into the full House where Republicans and Democrats vote. But it's always a party vote so that there are no defections from one side or the other for Speaker. Shortly after, and I had a race the first month I was there, I decided to go for Ways and Means Committee. There are three exclusive committees in the House: Appropriations, Ways and Means, and the Rules Committee. Those three are the dominant committees, and you more or less have to run to be a member, except for the Rules Committee, which is normally handled by the Speaker. So I ran for Ways and Means and had a tough race, but I was fortunate enough to prevail over an older member who happened to be a Catholic priest from Wisconsin, who was a fine person, and later, a couple of years later, he left, but I was very fortunate to get on the Ways and Means Committee.
And it is a standing joke in Washington that you must be a member for at least 3 terms before you can get a parking place. But you were different. You were different. You moved up the ladder, you became majority whip. You served on important committees, Budget Committee, Ways and Means Committee. How did you manage all that so quickly?
Well, I had some good help from, I had been a staff member back in the 60s, early 60s. And I had made some acquaintances at that time who were in the House and remained in the House. Ross Inkowski from Chicago, several other members who were very helpful to me in getting on the committee and later supporting me for deputy whip and really being responsible for placing me on the Budget Committee. Also, I served on a sentence on the Ethics Committee. No one wanted to be on the Ethics Committee, and I'm sure it's true more so today than it was last month. But the Ethics Committee is a committee that handles, as you know, all of the in-house problems. And there are generally a multitude of those, most of which are not publicized. Because a lot of things come up that are simply untrue or blown all out of proportion, and they're handled very quietly in the House. Others, during my era, we had abscam, you remember, where one member was expelled for taking a bribe. His name was Ozzie Myers from Pennsylvania. He was a Democrat from our party, and he had taken a bribe, and others were censured. There was a Republican from Florida by the name of Kelly, if I recall correctly. But at any rate, this was the first member of Congress who had ever been expelled from the House for anything other than treason. So as you look at expulsions, not many of those have occurred through the years.
You were a good friend of Speaker O'Neill.
I was a good friend of Speaker O'Neill.
What was he like?
He was he and I fought a great deal. He opposed me for Ways and Means Committee. Because I was too moderate, too conservative. He came from a very liberal district, a organized labor type candidate and member. And incidentally, I knew him before when I was on staff. But he was a very likable, congenial person. He and President Reagan got along quite a bit together private. They were, both had some Irish, and both could tell great stories. Each of them probably had an evening drink. But they got together quite often, but they fought publicly, and they were on different sides philosophically. But that did not break up a friendship. He was a very smart fellow in many, many ways. Incidentally, another one that some of you may have, you don't remember, but you may have read about, Sam Rayburn. When I was a staffer, I don't know if I can tell this or not. I was a member of the Young Donkeys, the Young Democrat Burroughs Club. And they had an Elvis Club for the young staff members on the Republican side. And the people who take down in shorthand, like a court reporter, everything that is said in the House chamber is, they had come to us as an organization and asked us if we would support their efforts to get an increase in their compensation. And I was serving as an officer of the Burroughs Club, and I was not the president. But I went with the president. We made an appointment. It took weeks to get with Sam Rayburn. And we walked into his office, and he was small in stature, but he was behind this huge desk, and I'm sure as staffers he looked much larger than what, because we had to walk a long ways to get to it. I remember in the speaker's office. He didn't say anything. His staff told us to present what we wanted to ask him, and we did. And finally he said, "How much do they make now?" And we said, $6,000 a year. And he said one word that started with an S. And we stood there thinking that we were going to have more conversation, even though he didn't really accept our first argument. He said nothing else. And finally his staff said, "Y'all can leave now." That was my only conversation. I never got to speak to him again.
And a few words.
But I understood what he meant.
Get the raise?
Not then.
You were a member of the Blue Dogs. Would you tell us what the Blue Dogs were and a little bit about the organization?
Well, basically, it was an informal group of Southerners and people from the Southwest primarily, who were more moderate, more conservative than the leadership in the House. And the group would meet on most issues and try to either moderate, and if that was done, issues, bills that come before the House. And if that was unsuccessful, to, in many cases, oppose. But generally, the effectiveness of that group became somewhat less as time went on, because a lot of members, a lot of districts elected Republicans in lieu of conservative Democrats, and therefore the numbers dwindled somewhat.
How did you come up with that name?
Well,
Yellow Dogs, we know. Blue Dogs, we don't.
Well, the Yellow Dogs always voted the line,
Right.
and so it could not be called the Yellow Dogs, so someone came up with the name, and I did not know the Blue Dogs.
Question.
You were there during the Iran hostage affair, then.
Yes, I was.
Could you tell us something about that period and how the Carter administration tried to handle that, and some of
I'll be delighted to. I wanted to, before I forget it, I told you about my grandfather's store. It was an administration building. And that's the picture used to stand up there at the burn. many years after 1910. My grandfather, since 1906. My grandfather died in 1910, and so I know this building burned. But all the family, we picked out all of them, and they're there on the porch of that. I'll be delighted to talk about the Iran-Contra. Is this a good time?
That was my next question.
Okay. Of course, during the Iran-Contra hearings, it said about hostages in Lebanon, and of course, Iran played a big part prior to this. But let me go back just a minute. This issue had been festering for some time. We have been supportive at that time of Iraq in their war with Iran. As you know, probably know, Iraq lost 1 million people in that war over a 9-year period of time. And it was a very vicious war. I have been to that part of the world and spent a little time in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it's the same type of warriors, and they are very tough fighters. But at any rate, going back to Iran-Contra, there were allegations that the United States had been trying to sell arms to Iran, make a profit on that without any government approval, really, but to make a profit on that and send that money to the freedom fighters that Reagan supported very heavily in Nicaragua. The history of that was that we had supported the freedom fighters financially in Nicaragua, but then the aid had been cut off. And Reagan wanted to find a way to send money to the forces that were fighting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, which he thought were, and probably correctly so, was communist. And he was fearful that they would take over this part of Central America. So there were allegations that even though the Congress and the President had signed off on this, that no aid would go, that we were actually sending aid through private sources. A joint committee was formed of the Senate and the House. I think we had 12 members, I believe, in the House, and fewer than that in the Senate of both parties. And I served on that committee. I was the only non-chairman to serve on the Iran-Contra committee from the House. The Dick Cheney incident was on that committee, served with me on that committee from the Republican side. Sam Nunn served as a member from the Senate side. As we commenced these hearings and started looking into it, it was a fascinating thing because really what had happened, Colonel North, who is a big celebrity now, but Ollie North at that time was a lieutenant colonel, which is not very high on rank as far as the people in D.C. that are calling the shots normally. But he worked for the National Security Council. And there was created something, Secretary Schultz was the Secretary of State. This was during the Republican administration. And Casey was head of the CIA. And Casey was very much wanting to find some way to finance this war against the Sandinistas, which the Congress had cut off the aid. So North was a willing participant with Casey and Admiral Poindexter, who was over at the National Security Council. And they conceived this idea that we will sell through Israel so as to keep our name out of it. Israel wanted to open up some dialogue with Iran because they feared Iraq more than they feared Iran at that time. So the idea was conceived that we would use some private, this was conceived by Ollie and Poindexter, but primarily by Ollie North and a fellow named McFarland, that they would give Israel some tow missiles, 1,000 to be exact. And they in turn would sell those missiles to Iran at a profit, and that we would then skim off the profit and it would be, put it in a Swiss bank account, which was opened up. And we'd use that money to finance the freedom riders. They hired a fellow by the name of Albert Hakim, who was, I used to prosecute fraud cases federally, but he was the epitome of a economist. He was bright. He was an American citizen in California, but of Iranian descent. And a fellow by the name of Secord, who had been a general in our Air Force. The two of them together orchestrated this thing, and we actually did sell, or they did, to Iran 504 tow missiles and numerous spare parts which Iran could not even buy. We couldn't sell anything to Iran. It was against the law. And all of this went on. Secretary Shields didn't know anything about it. As a matter of fact, when I questioned Ollie North, and I was the first one to question him on the House side incident, he said that the president didn't know anything about this. Vice President Bush, that's Bush 1, did not know anything about this. The Senate did not know anything about this. The House did not know anything about this. I asked him, I said, are you telling me that not a single elected official in the United States of America knew about this? And he had to say, yes, I guess that's true. He said, I thought the president knew, but he was also covering a little bit for Reagan. Fascinating story. Ultimately, it was, to my thinking, it was a dangerous time in this nation because actually Hakim went to Europe and met with the some of the Iranian officials, and he was the only one that spoke Farsi in the group, and he was not a public official. He was a private. He was going to make 2%. His incentive was that if we opened up trade with Iran, it would be $15 billion at that time estimated a year, and he would get 2%. The checking account that all of this money was run through was a numbered account in Switzerland. And when we finally discovered all of this and closed it down, it had $8 million in it. Now, I tried to get Ollie North as well as Hakim to say that they wouldn't take any of this money and that they would be willing to forfeit this. North finally said he would forfeit any. He didn't have any interest. But Hakim, I don't know what happened to the $8 million. I can't tell you. But it was a dangerous time because Hakim was actually on the back of an envelope, had 9 points that he was agreeing to on behalf of the United States government with the Iranian officials, one of which was to have Israel release a very dangerous criminal. And Hakim was taking care of that too. I mean, he was the negotiator, which was a very difficult time. One of the interesting things about Ollie North, and I'm not a great fan, as you can see, of Ollie North, but I know he's popular and that sort of thing, but one of the interesting things was that we saw that Ollie benefited from that was by check was that they purchased a security system at his home there in Washington, a fence, electronic fence, for $30,000. But the interesting thing about this, and there might have been some justification, he said he was feared for his family's life because some of these terrorists were going to get him. But the interesting thing about that, he wrote a letter and backdated it 6 months and had it mailed from the security fence people to him, saying that, as you know, this is a demonstration project, and we'll have people come in and look at this. We're doing this free gratis for a lot of things. And then he said, no, that's not true, and I shouldn't have done that. But interesting little side things.
Follow up on that. What do you say to those who say that deal was made before the election and it was convenient that the hostages were released after the election?
Well, I don't really know. I don't really know.
That's a good question.
Yes, it is. And I couldn't comment. I will say one thing, and I brought it along because I thought somebody would ask me about Iran-Contra. I've got all the hearings at home, copies of them, but I wanted to say, if I've got a minute, occasionally I will read something or get something on the internet about Iran-Contra. And since I've served on the committee, it always fascinates me to see what this year about 9/11, of course, we had a lot on the internet. But I had seen this back when Al Gore was running for president. I want to read this, if you don't mind. It'll take about 3 minutes. And it shows a video of Ollie North testifying at the Iran-Contra hearings during the Reagan administration. And they said, there was Ollie in front of God and country getting the 3rd degree from him. But what he said was stunning. He was being drilled. Incidentally, I supported Contra aid in Congress, which the president supported. But I opposed this apparatus because I think it was not only illegal, but I think it was extremely dangerous. This says he was being drilled by a senator. Did you not recently spend close to $60,000 for a home security system? Some of y'all may have gotten this. Ollie replied, yes, sir, I did. The senator continued, trying to get a laugh out of the audience. Isn't that just a little bit excessive? No, sir, continued Ollie. No, and why not? The senator asked. Because the lives of my family and I were threatened, sir. Threatened by whom? The senator questioned. By terrorists, sir, Ollie answered. A terrorist? What terrorist could possibly scare you that much? His name is Osama bin Laden, sir, Ollie replied. At this point, the senator tried to repeat the name but couldn't pronounce it, which most people back then probably could. A couple of people laughed at the attempt. Then the senator continued. Why are you so afraid of this man? The senator asked. Because, sir, he's the most evil person alive that I know of, Ollie answered. And what do you recommend we do about him? Well, sir, if it's up to me, I would recommend that an assassin team be formed to eliminate him and his men from the face of the earth. The senator disagreed with this approach, and that was all that was shown on the clip. He went on to say that that person incident, that senator that was asking him these questions, was Al Gore. Well, Al Gore didn't serve on the committee. Was never on Iran-Contra committee. He never asked a single question to anyone because he wasn't there. Second of all, Osama bin Laden's name was never mentioned in all of the volumes of testimony about Iran-Contra. Sometimes the internet things are not accurate. Before we put that to bed, I want to ask you a couple of questions. It seems that Iran-Contra affair
begs several questions. One is what role Congress should play in the oversight of foreign affairs, and secondly, the limits on the executive branch, if there are any, in the conduct of this type of arrangement.
The Congress has yielded a great deal of its oversight responsibility in the last 50 years. Part of that has probably come about because we have gone away from bipartisanship in foreign policy. And since you no longer have bipartisanship, in my view, every party, each of the two major parties, protects its own if they're in charge of the Congress, and you have no oversight. You don't have any oversight today into a lot of things that are occurring that you might have if you have a Democratic House or a Democratic Senate, either one, which I think is very healthy for the minority party to have control of at least one of the houses. The other problem comes with, you do have some checks and balances in that the Congress can limit funding. That is a harsh way to control if you don't have oversight, but you can control the expansion of things by limiting funding. But it's always difficult to do that because many times, such as today, if you have soldiers American soldiers in foreign countries such as Iraq, obviously members don't want to cut off funding, even though they may not agree with what's happening, because they're fearful that it could impact the soldiers, our soldiers that are there. We ought to have a very strong oversight committee to follow all foreign policy issues. And I think it would work better under both Republican and Democratic administrations if we had that. It'd be healthier for the nation.
So Congress cut off funding to the Contras.
Yes, there is.
Doesn't that make the Reagan administration role in that a little more serious?
It does in particular because we cut off everything, or they cut off, I didn't vote for it, but they cut off everything except humanitarian aid. And strong personalities within the executive branch then took the position, well, I don't care what the Congress said, we're going to finance this. Incidentally, they didn't finance it only by the sale of arms to Iran. They also went, as I described it in the committee in my questioning, with 10 cups, begging other countries. And we had 6 countries that contributed about $30 million into the secret account. And we couldn't identify these countries in public. So there you see them, if you read the hearings, there's country number 1 and country number 3 and country number 4 and so forth. It was a lot of the, Brunei was one of them, gave $3 million if I recall. The danger in that, at that particular time, I had passed a textile to protect the textile industry in this nation, because I have a lot of textiles in the South, as you know. I had passed it through the House, passed through the Senate, and it was waiting for, it was waiting at that time when we were having these hearings for the president's veto. Reagan was going to veto it, and I knew that, and I was going to try to override his veto. But at the same time, some of these countries were people who would benefit from a veto of the textile bill, because of some of these textile producing countries. And I think that's very dangerous, because you can compromise. You can be compromised if you're begging for money to go someplace that is not appropriated by the federal government.
So you don't think the president should have unconditional authority to conduct foreign policy over the objection to the Congress?
No, I don't. I think that when it comes to, especially when it comes to war, I think that the Constitution, we haven't had a declaration of war since World War II. We didn't have it in Korea, we didn't have it in Vietnam, we had it in Iraq. Had resolutions tended to authorize certain actions, but we've never had a declaration of war. I think that the Congress should retain that right as provided in the Constitution. And if we're going to war, we ought to debate it in the halls of the Congress and vote yes or no. Now, there are exceptions for immediate emergencies, that type of thing, an immediate attack. But I don't think that we ought to have the executive branch calling all the shots in foreign policy.
Do you think we should be providing funds to those types of organizations anyway, like the Conscious or in other parts of the world?
And sometimes it may be wise to do so. It may be right now. We have a terrible situation in North Korea. I don't know, because I haven't been there a dozen years, but I don't know what the situation is, but it could be a very dangerous time, and we probably need to have some distance. I don't know, we may be beyond that point right now.
There's a lot of dissidents.
Yeah.
There are.
Incidentally, you know, in that part of the world, in the part of the world where we are now in Iraq and in the Middle East, I went, took a trip one time with a group in Afghanistan that was fighting the Soviets. And the Soviets killed, according to Afghans, almost a million people from Afghanistan. And the more they killed, the more came across the border from other places to fight the Soviets. And the Soviets wanted to get out. They decided, you know, even Alexander the Great only spent 30 days there when he came through the Khyber Pass. And it's been, I went to the Khyber Pass instantly to see where Alexander the Great came through. And at that time, the war was going on. But the Soviets wanted to get out, and my congressional group asked one of the Taliban, at that time we were supporting them, about letting the Soviets go home. And he said, I shall never forget his response. He was one of the tribal leaders. And he said, it may take us 50 years, it may take us 500 years, but we will kill as many Soviets as they killed of us. That's their mentality, I think.
Well, let's talk for a minute about the first Gulf War. I never talked to you about that. You voted against funding that war.
I did.
Any particular reason?
Well, I had 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, I just got out of the Grand Conquer and I didn't believe anyone at that point. And the government. And from the executive branch, I had, incidentally, people from Grand Conquer are the same people, some of the same people that were involved in this decision on Iraq. Poindexter, Abrams, remember him? Some of these same people who had been convicted after Iran conquered, but had been pardoned, and then they came back into the administration. But second of all, I thought this was possibly more about oil than anything from our perspective. Not that that is entirely unreasonable, very honestly. It was as much about oil as anything. Because, and from an economic standpoint, that's important to this nation. But if that had been a country in Africa, and the same thing had happened, we wouldn't have known it. There was a strong economic interest. So I felt that before we did anything, we ought to try for another, we had people there, to try to see if we could resolve this. Because, as I say, we had just been supporting Saddam. And all of these things that he did as a criminal, especially against the Kurds, had happened 10 years before we went into the war. This was not an immediate thing that had occurred. But in Bush's favor, Bush won. Saddam had invaded Kuwait. And there was a danger that that could spread. And I understood that. But I thought that the debate should take place. Furthermore, my good friend Sam Nunn in the Senate, who was on the Armed Services Committee chairman, voted the same way. That had some influence on me, I think.
But if you had to pass judgment on that, do you think we accomplished what we should have accomplished in that first Gulf War?
Well, we accomplished stopping Saddam and running him out of Kuwait. And I think that President Bush understood that if we went beyond that, a lot of people say, why didn't we go then and eliminate Saddam? I mean, that was basically the statement I hear a great deal. But I think Bush won, who had been head of the CIA at one time, better understood that part of the world than a lot of other people, and I really believe that he figured it was going to be awfully difficult to get out if we went in. And he was correct.
Sir, could you cite for us or explain those provisions in the Constitution which require the Congress approval before we declare war? We had a police action in Korea, and we haven't declared war since. Why does Congress do this? Doesn't it? Can you?
It does specifically say that Congress shall have the right to declare war.
So why don't they do that?
Well, they get around it by a little figure of speech saying this is not really a declaration of war as such. It's simply a police action. We did it in Korea, we did it in Vietnam, we did it in we had pass resolutions, which has a legal effect, Tonkin resolution.
And yet, every day, we are at war, is announced to us. We are at war, excuse me, against not an outfit or a leader, but an idea, terrorism. How can we do that?
Well, we can send troops, the president can send troops. And then, as I indicated, the Congress can cut off the money if they want to, where it has to come home. That is the only real effective way that the legislative branch can check, if you will, the executive branch. And Congress is always very reluctant to do that for a lot of reasons. But once you're into a conflict, it's difficult to stop it. The public generally does that. The public in Vietnam, I guess, probably had more to do with the decision to pull out, declare victory, than anything else. But you're absolutely correct. The Constitution does delegate to the Congress the authority to declare war, not to the executive branch. I like, I won't sound too partisan, because the Democrats don't control either house or the presidency or the courts right now. But I like to see, regardless if it's a Democrat president, I think we're better served if we have one house in the opposite party. That sort of makes for an oversight, if you will. You see, when you're in the, right now, the majority party is the ones responsible for having oversight. If they don't want to investigate something, it doesn't make any difference what the minority party wants. There will be no committee set up to produce oversight. And people say, well, why didn't the Republicans or why didn't the Democrats do this when the opposite party was in power? They couldn't have, but they were in the minority. Just as the Democrats today cannot have oversight committee about Iraq. So sometimes you have to bide your time. You can have public statements and speeches and all of this sort of thing, but as far as official action, you can't do it.
Ed, you mentioned that you would favor an oversight committee to deal with foreign policy. That would be a committee representing both houses of Congress.
Joint committee.
Joint committee of some kind. To what extent would it be empowered?
Just in oversight, be able to bring witnesses, to bring different points of view, to investigate if there's, if someone is not telling the truth, that type of thing. And as far as any power to stop anything, they shouldn't have. That should be up to the president and Congress. But there ought to be oversight, in my view, which I do not believe there is at the present time.
Would this be something akin to the Truman Committee in World War II?
No, I would want, I think that commission, the Truman Commission, was not a legislative commission, I don't believe. I would want from the Senate and the House a joint committee with equal members to have the power to investigate. There are a lot of issues that ought to be looked into in addition to whether or not we should go to war. That is, you're having rip-offs, which you do in every war, the waste of money, people who are ripping off the taxpayers. All of those things ought to be brought to light. Yes, ma'am.
We have so many problems, but what would you say is the largest problem facing the United States, and what would your recommendations be to solve that problem?
No, Bruce.
We only got 3 hours.
Well, I guess I'd have to say right now that our biggest problem is Iraq. How to either prevail or how to get out without losing face around the world. I don't know that I could recommend anything other than this. I've heard a lot of suggestions about immediate withdrawal or stay the course. You know, we sent troops in World War II, and we've been in this conflict longer than World War II. It's been this month, I guess, next month. we trained American soldiers in less than 3 months' time in some of the battle. I think that we ought to say to Iraq, now that they have a government, you have to train your troops, and while we have done it in 3 months in the past wars, we're going to give you longer than that. But we'll be out of here. So you better train them. And if you want to save your country, you've got to do it in the next 8 months or the next 12 months, whatever a reasonable amount of time, which I think ought to be within a year or so. And say, we're coming out now. We won't let any other country invade you. We'll be over here in a neighboring country with our troops. But from your own decision between the Kurds and Shiites, Sunnis, you have to sit down and either work it out or your country is going to be destroyed internally, which looks like it's heading that way now. I really think Iraq, I mean, you can't spend like we're spending. We've spent almost $400 billion on this Iraq situation. 2,700 plus young troops and women, thousands wounded. At some point, you're going to have to say we can't spend any more than what we've spent. You know, the $400 billion would have shored up Social Security forever. One decision, as well as Medicare. So I think Iraq is the...
When you say at some point, you got any idea where that point is?
When you ought to come out, you mean? I would think, I am prejudiced and biased because I was opposed to the war. Going in, I would not have gone. I would not have supported it.
Amen.
But now that we're there, we can't come out. You know, you have to deal with the problem that you are faced with now. I think if you pull them out in a month, 2 months, I think that you're guaranteeing a disintegration of Iraq, and it could impact us for years to come. So I think that we have to have a reasonable time that the government knows that we're going to pull out. And we do so in a manner that is not wholly destructive of potential for Iraq to become a democracy, if you will, a form of a democracy.
What do you think would have been the proper action for us to have taken after 9/11 other than going into Iraq?
I think we would, the proper approach would have been to determine whether or not Iraq had anything to do with it.
Yeah.
Which they didn't.
And if they didn't, what?
If they didn't, then I would try to do what we've done in the past, try our best to gradually, in increments.
Bomb another pharmaceutical company.
To do a bomb? Well, I don't know that you would solve it with a bomb. I guess we've got the same problem, or worse, with Iran right now. I don't know how many, but my statement is, basically, I was wanting to make sure that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. I did not. Hindsight is always better than dealing with it at the time. But when we say everybody has the same, look at the same evidence, that's not correct. If you are a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee or the House Intelligence Committee, you see a lot more than the average member of Congress, first of all, because it's very limited. Second of all, the executive branch gives you the analysis. They don't give you the raw data. They give you the analysis that their people have made of what, and hopefully it's correct. Most of the time it is, not always.
I think that domestically speaking, this country is in a standstill because of the acrimony between the two parties. Now, I used to read about, they'd all get together after the session and sit around and sip bourbon and stuff like this. And they were all good friends. But, things got done, whereas we have a health care problem, we have a Social Security problem, we have a vast myriad of domestic problems that nothing happens because everyone's looking for their own advantage. And do they talk to each other anymore? When you were in the Congress, did you have any Republican friends that you really trusted and enjoyed their company? I have a lot of Democratic friends I think are great people.
Very much so. I had on my committee, of course, I was a moderate conservative, you understand. People, they like some of my positions. I'm talking about the opposite of the Republican Party. I voted to led the fight to reduce capital gains taxes. It was successful. I led the fighting committee to reduce the estate taxes. It was successful. Barbara Conover from New York was a great friend of mine. He later became president of the World Bank. He was the ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee. John Duncan from Tennessee, who served on the Ways and Means Committee. The Democrats ignored what was happening on C-SPAN. When the far right, for lack of a better word, the religious right became very active politically, when the liberal Democrats would not do anything to moderate from left of center. All of these things rather converged at the same time. Incidentally, I ran for majority leader of the House in late 80s. Strategic by Big Gephardt. And a president race that I put together in the South and a few of the North. But we did have bipartisanship and we did have meetings together, and Reagan was fairly good at this. But it didn't last, and we're in an era now where there is no rapport between the two parties.
But this works on the state level too, it looks like, that people just don't have any respect for each other and their views and say, well, it's either my way or the highway. And I think this is ridiculous. I mean, I need a little input.
Yes.
Congressman, don't you think, though Tommy Franks was about the smartest fella, he went to Baghdad and resigned because he saw what was coming?
I really don't know that much about him, because all of this has happened since I left. You know, we've got in trouble since I left office.
I tried to get you to stay.
So I don't really know how to comment, but there have been so many difficulties in the Iraq situation that it disturbs me for the country to be so divided on this. There must be a better way than the way we have. There's a lack of trust now, a lack of people don't have the confidence that they really need. Incidentally, I'm serving on this page thing that's just come up this week. I was on the ethics committee when the Democrat and the Republican were charged one of each party would have an affair with a 17-year-old. And that was a very difficult time, I'll tell you why. We had hired a former HEW, head of HEW lawyer, to investigate. And he questioned every page and former page back for 20 years that he could find. Took several weeks to do this. And they found two instances. One was a homosexual affair, one was a heterosexual affair. Both of the minors were 17 years of age. But the woman was married, it was 10 years before. Had a nice family and obviously didn't want to pursue or help the government. So we made an agreement between the parties not to mention her, not to list her name. And the homosexual affair had happened about 8 years before, if I remember correctly. But both parties were in their 20s when we discovered this, and they were censured. Both of them. One of them was defeated. Crane, the Republican, was defeated. I think the Democrat was elected again in three terms. But it was totally destroyed as far as any effectiveness that we had. So this is not anything really new, you know. Washington without a scandal is like a honky-tonk without music. You're going to have something up there as well.
And we always close out our sessions by mentioning a few names to our guests and asking them a question of how history should treat them. You served with three presidents, Carter, Reagan, and Bush 1. How do you think history should remember Jimmy Carter?
I think probably more kindly than he is looked upon as a president today. Not altogether with his successes, but with his efforts. He attempted to find a way to contain medical costs. Hospital cost containment was what it was called at the time. It was ultimately defeated. But he was in the forefront in trying to bring some lid back in the late 70s to the expansion of to the high cost of medical care. I think that in some ways of domestic affairs, he will be treated more kindly. He certainly will be treated better as it relates to Egypt and Israel and to the Middle East. He had Sadat and Begin, and they did reach an agreement that has worked to a large extent. So I think that was worth the effort, and he should be commended. Now, he had a lot of failures as well, but I simply believe he probably will be treated a little bit better to start with. It's hard to say. He was not an easy person to deal with because he believed what he believed, and he didn't go too much for any gray areas.
About Ronald Reagan.
I think he'll be treated fairly well for his efforts in straight talk. He got along well, and he was able to fight, and then even with nations, I'm talking about not literally fight, but to disagree, and then have an opportunity later Russian Empire than any other single individual simply because of CNN. I think CNN had more to do when it went into Eastern Europe with the downfall of the Soviet Empire than any other single thing.
How about Bush 1?
Bush 1, didn't have a chance to, he's a very decent person. He served on Ways and Means Committee, incidentally, before me. But he was well liked on both sides. I don't think that in his term he really had an opportunity to do a great deal.
Bill Clinton.
Certainly tarnished, but probably the most popular and most effective of any recent president.
And while we're at it, Bush 2.
Well, if he's correct, if he is correct in what he's doing and successful in it, he will be treated very well. I fear that he's wrong. I hope he's right, but I fear he's wrong.
Newt Gingrich.
Extremely bright, very able, a visionary as far as political scene, not too much to be admired.
What do you think his chances in 2 years?
I don't think he has a good shot at it, but he might have.
My daughter was a page in Washington, D.C. about 10 years ago under Gingrich. Very admired Congressman Nathan Dill appointed her. The page program made it very clear from the onset that his girlfriend, the Duchess, was her code name, and that she should be treated with respect. And this was while his wife, Mary Ann, I believe, was down in Georgia. So that was told to the youth of our country.
Well, I knew all three of his wives, and I like them all.
I just thought that was interesting. Be upfront about it.
Two more. Two more, Ed. You ready?
Gary.
Carlton.
And on the energy program that President Carter had, don't you think that was one of his highlights, that it's been kept in place?
I think probably his efforts there, early on, if we had been able to get the public support that he needed for that, that it would have saved us a great deal. And incidentally, if we look down the road, if we don't solve the energy problem, we're going to have these problems in the Middle East and other places, as well as in Venezuela, Sudan, all of these places where we are now, and China is competing for fuel everywhere. You know, they're heavy. China is in the Sudan area. We've got to solve it some way. And Carter, I think, had the vision early on to try to begin, and was not able to do so.
This whole energy thing, it seems like everyone just brushes it under the table. You know, we have an oil problem. We have a problem with our automobiles. We just cannot sit down and say, look, and mandate that we're going to have 35 miles a gallon, 45 miles a gallon, or whatever we need to solve the problem and cut out the reliance on foreign oil, or we're going to go down the tubes. And neither party wants to step up to it. The administration, the executive, the legislature, or anybody wants to do anything. They're just going to go along. Now the price of gas is going down, and the Hummers are going to hum.
Well, let me say I appreciate the opportunity to come here. This little college probably has meant more to me than when you and I were there. And it really is a great, fine institution. And I urge everybody to support it because it's great for mountain kids.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we adjourn, would you please look at your green slip now? We won't be here next week, but the following week, we will pick up the town. We'll have two great guests here, as we did when we discussed Senator Russell. Please be back.
Where can we get a green?